China today has, by the end of this year, we have 3 million base stations for 5G, all the way to the base camp of Mount Everest, which means that the average Chinese has much more bandwidth than the average American or European or Singaporean. When I address alumni of Peking University in Singapore at the 100th anniversary of the May 4th movement, I said, God is Chinese. Now, there was a stir in the audience, and they remember that of the 8 of the G7 countries, if you take away Canada and add in Austro-Hungary and Russia, these 8 countries were the ones who ravaged China in the infamous 8-country alliance in 1898. All Chinese people remember that, how they ravaged China and took away artifacts which are still in Western museums. Xi Jinping, of course, brought his 52% Mao Tai from Guizhou. Ma Ying-jeou, not to be outdone, brought his 52% Jingwen Gaoliang. Both very good liquors and very warm words exchanged. Now, Xi Jinping was not doing it for Ma Ying-jeou because Ma Ying-jeou was stepping down. He was doing it for Tsai Ing-wen, whom everybody knew would be the next president.
本期视频是新加坡著名外交官、前外交部长杨荣文先生2023年5月应芬兰前总理亚历山大·斯图布的邀请，在欧洲跨国治理学院就中欧美关系发表主旨演讲的节选。杨荣文以其深刻的洞察与犀利的剖析，以及他对中国历史及国民性的深刻了解，为我们勾勒出未来全球格局的演变轨迹，以及大国关系不断变化的动态，尤其聚焦于中国的快速发展与中欧关系重塑的可能。在这个部分中，杨荣文不仅用数据和事实揭示了中国的惊人进步，更以历史纵深为坐标，探讨了欧洲在中美博弈中的角色选择，以及台湾问题这一不容触碰的红线。首先，杨荣文谈到中国发展进步的不可阻挡，即便是在全球多数国家在疫情中挣扎于封锁、停滞与经济衰退时，中国却仍然走出了一条不同的轨迹，包括逐年猛增的贸易顺差、异军突起的汽车产业、华为领先全球的 5G 实力，还有中国经济不依靠印钞而实现平稳发展的稳健性。所有这些数据都在提醒欧洲，你们要重视中国的发展，更要正视中国的发展。接着，杨荣文深刻指出，中欧之间存在着严重的认知失衡，中国对欧洲的了解远超欧洲对中国的认知。这种差距源于历史上的不平等的交流模式，以及西方长期以来的傲慢与偏见。然而，中欧关系并非没有转机。杨荣文认为，欧洲应摒弃强行灌输的交流方式，以平等尊重的姿态与中国展开对话。在中美博弈的大背景下，欧洲拥有独特的战略地位，有能力在中美之间发挥平衡作用，推动世界向多极化平稳过渡。杨荣文几乎在他的每一次谈话或演讲中都要谈到台湾问题。他坚定地认为，台湾回归中国是2战后国际秩序的重要组成部分，是历史正义的必然要求。台湾问题是中国的核心利益，关乎国家主权和民族尊严，不容任何外部势力干涉。他奉劝欧洲国家应认清台湾问题的本质，避免被美国裹挟，在涉台问题上谨言慎行，以免损害中欧关系大局。
Just to give you a sense of how much China moved ahead. In 2021, China's merchandise trade surplus was $520 billion. In 2021, it went up to $670 billion. In 2022, when the rest of us thought that China was in turmoil, the merchandise trade surplus went up to $870 billion. Now, in Europe, America, Japan, the printing presses were working 24/7 to provide the money supply which kept us all fed. And life was normal apart from physical deprivation of movement. But the guy beavering away at the corner, he was collecting all that money. And that's why Chinese money is now flowing out to buy assets in the world. In Singapore, we got a trickle. It's causing terrible asset inflation. 3-star restaurants have booked months in advance. Golf club memberships have doubled in Sentosa. The queue for Porsches, Lamborghinis, Bentleys, Rolls Royces, in the months, if you know the dealer. Many people don't realize that during the 3 years of COVID, China was not marking time. People were not at home playing with their computers. They were making things. So when they had the motor car show in Shanghai recently, Western companies, Japanese companies were shocked that in those 3 years, the Chinese auto industry surged ahead. And just a few days ago, China reported that it exported more cars than Japan. It already produces more cars than anybody else by a long shot. And for electric vehicles, they are way ahead of anybody else. And it's not just the cars, but what's in the cars. You know, in the West, because of security concerns, and because US intelligence agencies do not want to lose their monopoly of being able to surveil everybody, you ban Huawei, because Huawei could do the same thing. But in so doing, you have denied yourself of 5G. China today has, by the end of this year, we have 3 million base stations for 5G, all the way to the base camp of Mount Everest, which means that the average Chinese has much more bandwidth than the average American or European or Singaporean. And when you have bandwidth, there are products and services which young people can develop and experiment with, which others elsewhere could not. And this year, China will account for 35% of global growth. They talk about 5% growth. Economists say maybe 6%. Well, that might be too optimistic, but China will grow at more than 5% this year, and probably faster next year. And unlike in the advanced economies, where all that money printed is causing inflation to go up, in China, interest rates are trending down. When I address alumni of Peking University in Singapore at the 100th anniversary of the May 4th movement, I said, God is Chinese. Now, there was a stir in the audience. It is nothing new. The Jesuits understood this from the beginning, that in order to persuade, in order to attract, you must insert, you must inculturate. And only when you do that, when you're interested in me, I like you, because you're interested in me. If you're not interested in me, and all you want is to proselytize, I'm not interested in you. But if you're interested in me, my fears, my hopes, I find you very attractive. And that begins the process of persuasion, a chemistry. Between Europe and China, there was such a chemistry. But during the period of Western ascendancy, there was no longer any need for a chemistry because the interaction was by force. You're losing that force. But you continue to have many things to impart to the rest of the world. And it must be done not by proselytizing, but by being attractive. And you become attractive by being interested in others. And when you are, a process begins. The Chinese, you know, we just had the G7 meeting in Hiroshima, and there were many statements which the Chinese found highly offensive because it asserted a China which the Chinese don't believe is a fair description. And they remember that of the 8 of the G7 countries, if you take away Canada and add in Austro-Hungary and Russia, these 8 countries were the ones who ravaged China in the infamous 8-country alliance in 1898. All Chinese people remember that, how they ravaged China and took away artifacts which are still in Western museums. So when the G7 makes these accusations, emotionally, there is a reaction. But they've decided that they are growing and that the China today is not the China of 100 years ago. In 2003, a big group of scholars produced a wonderful series in 12 episodes, each 45 minutes, called The Rise of the Great Powers, 大国崛起. And it began with Henry the Navigator of Portugal, and how this tiny nation at the end of the world, at the end of the Reconquista, decided to go out, followed by Spain. And how in Tordesillas they got the Pope to divide the world between the two of them, which was astonishing. Then they talk about Holland and how he created the joint stock company, which was a great innovation in global finance, the idea of limited liability. Of course, it accounts for many of our problems today too, but without limited liability, the modern economy could not have come about, and for which we have to thank the Dutch. The episode on France was fascinating because it began with a debate in the French Assembly about whether Alexander Dumas should enter the Pantheon. And Jacques Chirac weighed in. The commentator said, what country is this? What civilization is this? That there should be a national debate about a writer. On Russia, the episode began with Peter the Great witnessing the execution of his own son, to make the point that reform is dangerous business. And if you fail, you die. Great Britain had 2 episodes, in one of which they quoted Churchill when he said that Shakespeare is more important, more valuable to the empire than all of India. It was a reflection. The series was produced without rancor, almost with admiration, but with one purpose: to study, to learn, to avoid mistakes. So today, I would say that China's understanding of Europe is much greater than Europe's understanding of China. But to have a chemistry, it must be two-way. And institutions like the STG should be a part of it, to continue in the tradition of Marco Polo, of Matteo Ricci. The big question in the world today is a titanic contest between the US and China. The US is a relatively young country. The Chinese think that it's almost infantile because it's only 300 years. It's about the length of one dynasty. And to think that a piece of paper, the US Constitution, can forever define that society, they consider a bit curious. But still, it is big, it is powerful, it is almost frightening. The problem is this. The US believes that China will behave like an imperial power when it becomes big or bigger. Now, China's per capita GDP is about 20% of the US today. Now, it's not inconceivable that the per capita income in China reaches half that of the US, because the Chinese are hardworking people. strong families, high savers, passionate about education. If China achieves half the per capita of the US, China's GDP will be that of the US and the EU combined. Now, if you're in business, we say, oh, yeah, this is very important information because it means that wherever you are, your biggest market, your biggest threat, your biggest opportunity will be China. And if that's the case, you better make sure that all your key people understand China. If not for offensive purposes, at least for defensive purposes. And it is on the cards. We may be, let's say, by 2050, 2060, 2070, we can be out by 10, 20 years. But without nuclear war, it's unstoppable. So this is the future we're talking about. And by 2050, given demographic trends, %30 of the world's population will be African, 40% Muslim, and by 2050, maybe 1 in 2 babies will be Muslim. So it is into that world that we've got to see the future and the relations among the great powers. China does not want to take on the US as global hegemon, not because they can't, but they think it is foolish. They think that to attempt to do it will lead to your own self-destruction. And they have ample examples in their own history that when they started interfering in the affairs of others, it will in the end boomerang back on them. The idea that American fleets should be in the Baltic, in the Black Sea, in the South China Sea, in the Sea of Okhotsk, wherever, they think, well, you can do that because you have the capability, but it costs you a fortune. And you can only do it now because you have the US dollar and the exorbitant privilege which comes to the US dollar. Now, we remember in the 60s, the Vietnam War, which was very expensive. And Johnson wanted to carry on with the Great Society program. So in the end, the US dollar had to be depegged from gold, and it led to horrifying inflation, which Paul Volcker later had to squeeze out at horrible pain to the entire world. They don't want to do that. In fact, in my view, they will never open the domestic capital market fully to London and New York. Because you do that, you lose control of monetary policy within the country. And China have always this belief that to preserve its homogeneity, and it's 92% Han, to preserve its homogeneity, you must always build walls around yourself. It can be a physical wall, it can be a capital markets wall, it can be a wall on Hollywood movies, on textbooks, and the most remarkable wall of all, in recent years, a biological wall that they built. You know, in the national anthem, which they sing every day, they talk about rebuilding walls. The Americans don't know this. They think that, like themselves, the Chinese are also a proselytizing missionary power. The Americans, when they come to Asia, sometimes it's cynical, but usually it's sincere. Their wish is for you to become like them. And they kept lecturing Lee Kuan Yew. He got so exasperated. So he said, make me a 51st state, and I'll follow your instructions. Then you look after me, you look after my defense. Now the question for Europe is this. You rely on the US for your defense, for your security. NATO, the transatlantic alliance. Is the EU, is that the foundation of the EU? Well, it's a big question in the future of Europe. What is European autonomy? It's not 1 or 0, but in which direction do you want to move? And what happens if the US turns inwards? Does this mean that it no longer have a foundation for European Union? So these are big issues. And the position Europe takes in the world will have a big bearing on whether we have peace or war between the US and China. Because if Europe, because of the transatlantic alliance, follows US policy on issues vital to China, particularly Taiwan, the likelihood of war goes up. But if Europe says, look, on these issues we agree with you because we are from the same civilization, but on those issues, no, then the Americans will be more circumspect and war becomes less likely. Because it's not triangular. It is bipolar with Europe somewhere at the fulcrum. And it can lean a little more to one side or the other and maintain stability. And if Europe does that, the transition to a multipolar world will be a much smoother one. But to do that, you need knowledge. It cannot be just the result of domestic electoral necessities. It cannot be the whim of political leaders who have no sense of history and little understanding of it. You need scholars, you need think tanks, you need Jesuits. This is very important because on the other side, they have their counterparts. And Taiwan is an issue so lightly played that is alarming to me. How European leaders, European countries say, oh, no, we love Taiwanese, we love Taiwan. They know nothing about Taiwan, but they love Taiwan. And they love to visit Taiwan, even though they can't remember the names and the places they visit. They do that in order to support the Americans and to satisfy themselves that they are being tough with China. Because China is too big, we've got to show that we are also strong. But Taiwan is a wrong card to play, because for the Chinese, Taiwan is a matter of historical justice. In the 1943 December, in Cairo, Stalin met Roosevelt, Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek. And in the Cairo Declaration, they make clear that Taiwan will be returned to China. In Potsdam, after the war ended in Europe, July 1945, it was Truman, and then halfway Churchill was replaced by Attlee because he had lost the elections in the UK, and Stalin. And they reaffirmed the Cairo Declaration in the Potsdam Proclamation. In other words, the status of Taiwan was long settled. During the Civil War in China, the American Navy helped the KMT to occupy islands in the South China Sea because the US accepted that those islands were part of China. They were occupied by Japan as a part of China. And so we returned to China. But now, because China is a preoccupation, many issues are being revisited, despite the history. But for the Chinese, Taiwan was lost because their fleet was sunk by Japan in 1994. And there was a humiliating peace agreement called the Treaty of Shimonoseki that year, leading to Japan taking over Taiwan and ruling it for 50 years. For China, it is not an issue which is negotiable. And any Chinese leader who takes a different position, however autocratic, will lose the overwhelming support of the Chinese people. Now, other issues you can talk about. You can talk about trade, you can talk about intellectual property, you can talk about chips. I think the Chinese can look after themselves. But on Taiwan, they will go to war. If they believe that the US intends to keep Taiwan separate, independent if possible, forever. The accusation is made that China is about to invade Taiwan, that Xi Jinping wants to do it for his legacy. This will not explain why in 2015 in Singapore, Xi Jinping, 2 years after he became president, met Ma Ying-jeou, the president of Taiwan in Singapore, as an equal. It was never done before. It was unprecedented. And it was done at great risk to himself. They had dinner at the Shangri-La Hotel. I was in the Quad group at the time, so I asked, who paid for the bill? I was told 50-50, down to the last cent, 50-50. Xi Jinping, of course, brought his 52% Mao Tai from Guizhou. Ma Ying-jeou, not to be outdone, brought his 52% Jingwen Gaoliang. Both very good liquors and very warm words exchanged. Now, Xi Jinping was not doing it for Ma Ying-jeou because Ma Ying-jeou was stepping down. He was doing it for Tsai Ing-wen, whom everybody knew would be the next president. I called on Tsai Ing-wen after she was elected, before she was installed. And she grumbled that the mainland was not forthcoming. I said, but Xi Jinping has just opened the road for you. It's not a superhighway, but it's a pretty good road. She kept quiet. She knew what I meant. But she would not take that road because even though she became president on the Constitution of the Republic of China, her own party constitution of the DPP, the first article says, our mission is to establish an independent Republic of Taiwan. So when Western powers lightly encourage the DPP to flirt with independence, you're touching a live wire. It will have consequences. So while I do not believe that China wants to invade Taiwan lightly, I believe that China will move if they are convinced that Taiwan has embarked on the road to independence. China can abjure the use of force, any more than Madrid can abjure the use of force if Catalonia were to declare independence unilaterally. Any more than London can abjure the use of force if Scotland were to declare independence unilaterally, or even Northern Ireland. But because you do not abjure the use of force, so we can be polite to one another and negotiate peaceful outcomes. But the mood in the Western media, partly deliberate, partly reflecting the mores of the time, is to paint a picture of China which is very dramatic and very black, and is leading to wrong decisions being taken in Europe. And yet the decisions being taken in Europe will have huge consequences for the world, and of course, for Europe itself.
杨荣文的演讲是对中国发展成就的客观呈现，也是对国际社会正确认识中国的呼吁。中国的崛起不可阻挡，在全球经济、科技等领域正发挥着越来越重要的作用。国际社会应顺应历史潮流，尊重中国的发展道路和核心利益，加强与中国的合作，共同应对全球性挑战。中欧关系的健康发展需要双方跨越认知鸿沟，以合作共赢为目标。台湾问题的妥善解决需要国际社会尊重历史事实，不干涉中国内政。在多极化趋势日益明显的今天，唯有通过平等对话与合作，才能构建一个更加公正、和平与繁荣的世界秩序。